There's a kind of silence that settles over a woman when the world decides she no longer exists. Not a peaceful silence, a heavy one. The kind pressed down by custom, law, and the slow erasure of a name that was never truly hers to begin with. In the ancient lands of Canaan, somewhere along the dusty inland roads between the hill country and the lowland valleys, a young woman sat in a house that was not her own, wearing the clothes of grief she had not chosen, waiting for a future that the man who controlled it had no intention of giving her. Her name was Tamar. We do not know the year with certainty, but historians generally place her story within the period known to scholars as the Middle Bronze Age, somewhere between 1700 and 1600 BCE in the hill country of Canaan, a land of terraced hillsides, seasonal rains, limestone villages, and a culture where a woman's entire survival depended on her attachment to a man. She was likely young when she was first given in marriage, perhaps in her mid-teens, as was customary among Canaanite and early Hebrew societies where girls were married shortly after puberty. Marriage was rarely a matter of affection. It was an economic arrangement between families, a transfer of custody more than a union of persons. Tamar had been brought into the family of a man named Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, a patriarch whose descendants would eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah had settled in the Canaanite lowlands, and when it came time to find a wife for his eldest son Tamar was chosen. We are told almost nothing about her origins. The text does not name her father's tribe or her city of birth. She may have been Canaanite herself, or she may have come from one of the neighboring peoples of the region. Her silence in the record is itself a historical clue. She existed, in the eyes of her world, primarily in relation to others. Her husband died. The biblical account says, God took his life because of his wickedness, though no specific deed is named. What followed was not mourning in the modern sense. What followed was custom, the ancient practice known as levirate marriage, which in Hebrew tradition would later be codified in the Torah under the term yibum. When a married man died without a son, his unmarried brother was expected to take the widow as a wife, so that the first husband's name and lineage would continue through the children born of that union. It was not romantic. It was a legal and social mechanism to protect both the dead man's inheritance and the widow's survival. Judah gave Tamar to his second son, Onan, but Onan refused to fulfill the obligation fully. He took Tamar as his wife, but ensured that no child would result. Whether his motivation was selfishness over inheritance or simple contempt for the arrangement, the text does not say. He too died. And now Tamar was twice a widow, still young, still childless, still waiting. Judah had a third son, Shelah, who was still a boy. He told Tamar to return to her father's house, to live as a widow until Shelah was old enough. This was not an unusual instruction. It was, on the surface, a practical delay. But as time passed and Shelah grew to adulthood and was not given to Tamar, it became clear that Judah had no intention of fulfilling his promise. Perhaps he feared a third son would also die. Perhaps he had simply moved on, but Tamar had not moved on. She could not. A widow without a son lived in a kind of social suspension. She could not remarry freely, could not inherit, could not simply begin again. She was dependent on the charity of her father's household, wearing the widow's garments that marked her as belonging nowhere. Then Judah's own wife died, and after his period of mourning had passed, he traveled to Timnah for the sheep shearing season. Sheep shearing was a time of celebration in ancient Canaan, a harvest of wool that brought men together in something close to a festival. Tamar heard he was coming, and she made a decision. She removed the widow's garments she had worn for years. She wrapped herself in a veil and sat at the entrance to Enaim along the road to Timnah. Judah saw her and assumed she was a zonah, a word the text uses that scholars have long debated. Some translate it as a prostitute in the commercial sense. Others suggest it referred more broadly to a woman outside of conventional social attachments, perhaps a cult prostitute associated with Canaanite religious shrines, or simply a woman whose face was covered and whose status was ambiguous. What is clear is that Judah did not recognize his daughter-in-law. He propositioned her. She negotiated a price, a young goat, and asked for his seal, his cord, and his staff as a pledge until the goat was sent. He agreed. The encounter happened. He left. She returned home, put on the widow's garments again, and waited. When Judah sent the goat and asked to retrieve his pledge, no woman matching the description could be found. The matter seemed to be over. Then, 3 months later, someone told Judah that Tamar was pregnant, and the accusation was immediate and brutal. She had played the harlot. The punishment Judah announced was death by burning. He had the legal authority. She was still his daughter-in-law, still technically under his guardianship, and in the legal culture of that world, an accusation of sexual misconduct against a dependent woman could end in execution. Tamar sent word to him before she was brought out. She sent the seal, the cord, and the staff, and said that the man who owned these objects was the father. Judah received them. He recognized them. And in that moment, in what scholars have called one of the most quietly remarkable declarations in the entire Hebrew text, Judah said, "She is more righteous than I." He acknowledged that he had withheld Shelah. He acknowledged that his failure had driven her to this. He did not punish her. He did not disown the children she carried. Tamar gave birth to twin sons, Perez and Zerah. And it is through Perez, the firstborn of that complicated, lawless, entirely human act of survival, that the genealogical line in Matthew begins its long walk toward David and eventually toward a stable in Bethlehem many centuries later. She was not forgotten. She was named. If Tamar's story teaches us that survival sometimes demands transgression, the next two women in this genealogy teach us something different, that belonging is not always determined by blood, and that loyalty can become a kind of covenant stronger than the one you were born into. Jericho sat in one of the most ancient inhabited places on earth. The city occupied a low plain just north of the Dead Sea, fed by a powerful spring that had drawn human settlement for thousands of years before the Israelites arrived at its walls. By the Late Bronze Age, around 1400 BCE, though the precise dating remains debated among archaeologists, Jericho would have been a fortified settlement, its walls built from mud brick on stone foundations, its streets narrow and shadowed, its economy dependent on trade routes that passed between the hill country and the Jordan River crossing. The climate was fierce. The valley below the Judean hills traps heat with particular ferocity, and in summer the air itself can feel like something pressed against the skin. Rahab lived somewhere within those walls. The text of Joshua calls her a zona, the same ambiguous word used to describe the woman Judah encountered at the road. Many scholars have suggested she ran an inn or a lodging house, an interpretation that makes practical sense. Since her home was located within the city wall itself, she received strangers, and she had access to information about incoming travelers. She was likely not a young woman. She had a household, a family she was responsible for. A father, a mother, brothers, and sisters all mentioned in her negotiation with the Israelite spies. She had agency, property, and some form of income. In the social hierarchy of a Canaanite city, she was not a woman of high status, but she was not entirely without resources. When 2 Israelite spies arrived in Jericho and came to her house, she took them in. She hid them under stalks of flax drying on the roof, flax that would eventually be processed into linen thread and cloth, a ubiquitous material in the ancient Near East. When the king of Jericho's men came asking, she redirected them, and then she spoke to the spies with a clarity that the text presents as remarkable. She told them she knew what the God of Israel had done, the parting of the sea, the destruction of the kings east of the Jordan. She said the hearts of Jericho's people had melted with fear. And she asked, in return for her protection, that her family be spared when the Israelites came. The spies agreed. They gave her a scarlet cord and told her to tie it in her window. When Joshua led the Israelites around the walls of Jericho, a ritual that, whatever its historical interpretation, resulted in the city's destruction, Rahab's household survived. She had made a gamble of extraordinary proportions, and she had calculated correctly. She settled among the Israelites. The text in Matthew names her as the mother of Boaz. Scholars note that this would place her in the lineage approximately one generation before Ruth, and while the chronology has been debated, the theological and narrative logic is consistent. Rahab, a Canaanite woman of uncertain standing in her own society, became part of the covenant people. She is later honored in the New Testament book of Hebrews alongside figures of deep faith. Her inclusion in Matthew's genealogy is not accidental. She represents the entry of an outsider, a Gentile, a woman from a condemned city, into the line that will produce kings. Ruth's story takes place roughly within the same historical period, though perhaps a generation later, in the time of the Judges, when Israel had no king and life in Canaan was marked by cycles of drought, war, and fragile local governance. The book of Ruth opens with famine. A man named Elimelech from Bethlehem took his wife Naomi and their two sons and traveled east to the plateau of Moab, a land on the other side of the Jordan and the Dead Sea, a landscape of broad wind-swept highland with grain fields and pasture land that was historically distinct from Canaanite lowland culture. Moab had its own language, customs, and religion, centered in part on the worship of Chemosh. Moabite women in Israelite cultural memory carried a complicated reputation, an association with episodes of syncretism and sexual transgression in the wilderness narratives. To be a Moabite woman in the eyes of Israelite custom was to carry a kind of social shadow. When Elimelech's sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, it was likely not celebrated by those who would later hear the story. Then Elimelech died. Then both sons died. Naomi was left with two daughters-in-law in a foreign country, no male protector, no inheritance, and no clear future. She decided to return to Bethlehem and told both young women to go back to their mother's houses, to find new husbands among their own people. Orpah wept and returned. Ruth did not. The words Ruth spoke to Naomi in that moment, words recorded in the Hebrew text and preserved in one of the most quoted passages of the entire Bible, were not a declaration of romantic love. They were a binding oath. Ruth said that wherever Naomi went, she would go. Where Naomi lodged, she would lodge. Naomi's people would be her people. Naomi's God would be her God. She would not be separated from her mother-in-law even in death. These were the words of Hesed, a Hebrew concept that sits somewhere between loyalty, covenant faithfulness, and loving kindness. It was not a feeling. It was a commitment made at significant personal cost. Ruth was likely in her 20s. She was returning to a country that was not hers, carrying no resources, no male protection, and a social identity that would have been visible immediately. She spoke differently. She looked different. Her background was different. In Bethlehem, she went to work in the grain fields during the barley harvest, gleaning behind the reapers. Gleaning was the ancient provision for the poor. The Torah commanded that harvesters leave the edges of fields and fall in grain for those who had nothing. It was hard physical work under the open sun of the Judean spring, bending repeatedly for hours, gathering the leavings that others had missed or deliberately left. She entered the field of Boaz, a wealthy landowner who was a relative of Naomi's dead husband. Boaz noticed her. He had heard her story, that she had left her own people to care for her mother-in-law. He instructed his workers to leave extra grain for her and to leave water for her to drink. He offered her protection in a field where, without his endorsement, a young foreign woman gleaning alone would have been vulnerable. When Ruth returned with more grain than could be explained by simple gleaning, Naomi understood immediately. She recognized the hand of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer, beginning to move. What followed was a carefully orchestrated series of events driven largely by Naomi's intelligence and Ruth's willingness. At the threshing floor during the night, Ruth lay at the feet of Boaz and asked him to spread the corner of his garment over her, a gesture with legal significance in ancient Hebrew custom, associated with protective covering and the assumption of responsibility. Boaz understood. There was a closer relative who had the first right of redemption. The next morning, at the city gate, before the elders of Bethlehem, Boaz settled the matter. The closer relative declined when he understood that redeeming the land of Elimelech meant also marrying Ruth. Boaz took both. Ruth married Boaz. She bore a son named Obed. Obed became the father of Jesse. Jesse became the father of David. A Moabite woman, a foreigner, a widow who had walked away from everything she knew out of loyalty to an old woman with nothing, she became the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. And she is named in Matthew's genealogy. By the time we reach Bathsheba, we have moved into a different world. The Jerusalem of approximately 1000 BC was becoming a capital city. David had taken the Jebusite stronghold on the ridge above the Kidron Valley and was transforming it into the political and religious center of a newly unified kingdom. The city was still modest by the standards of what would come later. The great temple had not yet been built. The architecture was a mixture of Canaanite construction traditions and the newer influence of craftsmen David had brought from Tyre to the north. But it was a city with a palace, with a court, with the weight of power settling into its stones. Bathsheba is introduced in the second book of Samuel with almost no preamble. She was the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a soldier in David's professional army, one of the elite warriors listed among his most loyal men. Her very name, Bathsheba, meaning daughter of an oath or daughter of abundance, is the only personal detail the text initially gives. We are told she was beautiful. We are told David saw her bathing from the roof of his palace. The bath she was taking was likely a ritual purification. The texts note that she had just completed her menstrual period, suggests this was a mikveh, a cleansing required by Jewish law following menstruation. It was an act of religious observance, not an invitation. David sent messengers. He had her brought. The text in Hebrew uses language that has been interpreted in different ways by different generations of scholars. Some have read the encounter as seduction, others as the exercise of royal power that left Bathsheba with no meaningful capacity to refuse. What is historically clear is this: David was king, he was in his palace, he was surrounded by the apparatus of state power, and Bathsheba was a subject. She went. She returned to her house. She sent word that she was pregnant. What followed was a sequence of events that revealed far more about David than about Bathsheba. David attempted to engineer Uriah's return from the battlefield so that the pregnancy could be covered by marital relations. Uriah, with an almost painful integrity, refused to sleep in the comfort of his house while his fellow soldiers were camped in the field. David had him placed at the front of the fighting, where he was killed. Bathsheba mourned her husband. Then David brought her to his house and made her his wife. The text says, plainly, that the thing David had done displeased God. The child born of the affair died. Bathsheba grieved again. She then bore David a second son. His name was Solomon. He would become the builder of the temple, the author of Proverbs, the king whose reign marked the apex of the ancient Israelite kingdom's cultural and architectural achievement. And it was Bathsheba who ensured that he, and not one of David's other sons, received the throne. When David was old and another son, Adonijah, began to move toward claiming kingship, it was Bathsheba who entered the aging king's chamber, reminded him of his promise, and secured the succession. In that moment, she was not a passive figure. She was a woman who understood power, timing, and the stakes of political inheritance. A woman who had survived the worst the court could do to her and had emerged with both her dignity and her purpose intact. Matthew's genealogy refers to her not by name. It says she who had been the wife of Uriah. The phrase is deliberate. It preserves the scandal without erasing it. It acknowledges the wrongdoing while still including her in the line. And for many scholars of biblical history, that inclusion is itself a quiet argument that the messianic line passed through imperfection, through coercion, through grief, through the complicated marriages of an imperfect king. The line did not require the people in it to be without fault. It required them to continue. Nazareth in the 1st century BCE was not a significant place. Archaeological surveys of the site have found evidence of a small village community, perhaps several hundred people, cut into the limestone hillside of Lower Galilee, a region of olive groves, grain fields, and small towns linked by dirt roads through the Jezreel Valley. The village would have smelled of cook fires and donkey dung, of olive oil pressed in small stone presses, of bread baked in outdoor clay ovens. Houses were built from the pale local limestone, their interiors cool and dim, their floors often carved from the bedrock itself. Families lived closely together, sometimes across a single courtyard, several generations sharing one water source, one storage room, one grinding stone. Mary was likely a young teenager when the events described in the Gospel of Luke occurred. 1st century Jewish girls in Galilee were typically betrothed in their early to mid-teens, and many scholars suggest she was perhaps 14 or 15 at the time of the Annunciation. She had been betrothed to Joseph, a craftsman. The Greek word used in the Gospel, tekton, can mean carpenter or stonemason, someone who worked with wood, stone, or both, a skilled laborer of modest means in a rural community. The betrothal was a legal contract, more binding than a modern engagement. To break a betrothal required a formal divorce. To be found pregnant during betrothal was a serious matter. The law of Moses provided for a woman in that circumstance to be brought before the elders, and in cases of adultery, to face public punishment. When Mary's pregnancy became apparent, Joseph's initial response, as recorded in Matthew's Gospel, was to plan a quiet divorce, a gesture of protection rather than fury, shielding her from public exposure, that he was persuaded otherwise by a dream, and that he chose to take her as his wife and protect both her and the child, placed him in an extraordinary position as well. But it is Mary's position we are considering here. A young girl from a village of no particular importance, in a province occupied by Roman imperial forces, in a time of political tension and economic pressure, suddenly carrying a secret that she could not fully explain and that the world around her would not easily accept. The journey to Bethlehem, described in Luke's Gospel as required by a Roman census, a historical detail that scholars have debated in terms of its exact dating and administrative logistics, would have been physically demanding for a woman at the end of pregnancy. The road from Nazareth south through the hill country to Bethlehem covered roughly 80 miles. Whether the family walked or had the use of a donkey, the journey through the limestone hills of Samaria and Judea would have taken several days. Bethlehem itself was a small town of the Judean hills, David's ancestral town, its terraced slopes planted with vines and grain. The birth happened in circumstances that even the gospel accounts describe as humble. A space associated with animals, a feeding trough used as a cradle. Mary was a mother before she was fully grown. She carried the weight of that paradox with her through the years in Galilee, raising a child about whom she was told extraordinary things, watching him grow in a village where neighbors knew her history, where the timing of his birth would never fully be forgotten by those who counted months. We know almost nothing about those years in Nazareth. The Gospel of Luke preserves one scene from his childhood, a journey to Jerusalem for Passover when Jesus was 12, and his disappearance into the temple courts for 3 days. When Mary found him and expressed how anxious she and Joseph had been, his reply was strange and difficult. She kept these things, the text says, in her heart. It is a phrase used twice about her in Luke's Gospel. It suggests a woman who held complexity internally, who did not always understand what she witnessed, but who carried it with her. Joseph disappears from the narrative after the childhood stories. He is assumed by most scholars to have died before Jesus' public ministry began. which means Mary was likely a widow by the time her son was baptized in the Jordan River and began gathering followers. She would have been in her mid to late 40s, perhaps, an age at which a woman in first century Judea would already have been considered old by the standards of a world where life expectancy was low and physical labor aged bodies quickly. She appears at the wedding at Cana. She appears among those who came to speak with Jesus while he was teaching, and she is mentioned in the context of his brothers. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark where those close to him say he has lost his mind, and his family comes to take charge of him. A passage that scholars have interpreted in many ways, none of them comfortable. She was in Jerusalem for the Passover of his death. She stood at the cross. It is difficult to write about this without falling into the trap of excess, and yet the historical reality demands honesty. Crucifixion under Roman practice in first century Judea was a public, deliberately slow, and explicitly humiliating form of execution. It was designed not only to kill, but to demonstrate imperial power and to warn onlookers. The condemned were typically stripped, flogged first with a flagrum, a leather whip with bone or metal embedded in its ends, capable of lacerating deeply, and then forced to carry the crossbeam, the patibulum, to the place of execution. The site outside Jerusalem's walls, known as Golgotha, was used precisely because it was visible from the road, a message in stone and flesh. The crowd at the Passover crucifixion was complicated. Jerusalem swelled dramatically during the feast. Estimates from ancient sources suggest tens of thousands of pilgrims arrived from across Judea and the diaspora. Roman authorities were always tense during Passover, a feast that celebrated liberation from a previous empire. The atmosphere that day would have mixed religious solemnity, political anxiety, the noise of a crowded city, and the particular horror that gathered around a public execution. Mary was perhaps in her late 40s. She stood near the cross, according to John's Gospel, with the beloved disciple and with other women. What she witnessed had taken perhaps 6 hours. The text records that Jesus spoke to her from the cross, giving the disciple responsibility for her care. It was an act of filial concern from a man in the act of dying, and it tells us something both about the nature of their bond and about the practical reality she faced. A widowed woman without a son who would survive her, entering old age with no immediate household to belong to. She appears once more in Acts, among those gathered in the upper room after the ascension, waiting with the disciples. She is named. Then she disappears from the canonical record entirely. Where she died, how old she was, what her final years looked like, these things are not preserved in Scripture. Later traditions, particularly in the Eastern Church, associate her death with Ephesus or with Jerusalem. Neither can be historically verified. She lived long enough to see everything she had been told come to its most terrible and, by her community's account, its most astonishing conclusion. What she understood of it, what she felt, what she said to the others who had gathered, these things are kept in a silence deeper than any text. There is something that does not appear in the genealogy of Matthew, and its absence is as telling as what is present. Of the 4 traditional patrilineal genealogies preserved in ancient Near Eastern cultures, none would have included these names. A Canaanite woman who tricked her father-in-law, a woman from a condemned city whose occupation was never entirely explained, a Moabite widow who had no legal claim to the inheritance she pursued, a woman whose presence in the story begins with a king's misuse of power, a teenager from an obscure village in an occupied province. By the standards of the world that produced them, not one of these women belonged in a royal genealogy. And yet Matthew named them all at the very beginning of his account, before he said anything else. Historians and biblical scholars have debated for centuries why these 5 women appear and not others. The matriarchs Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah are absent. The mothers of the patriarchs are absent. What these 5 share, and what distinguishes them from more obvious choices, is that each one stands at a hinge point where the line might have broken, where the expected path was blocked, and where survival required something that the conventional social order could not provide. Tamar survived because she acted outside the law that had failed her. Rahab survived because she chose loyalty to a God she had only heard about. Ruth survived because she chose an old woman and a foreign God over the familiar. Bathsheba survived because she outlasted the damage done to her and found a way to protect what remained. Mary carried a story the world around her had no framework to receive. Each of them lived inside a reality shaped by forces entirely beyond their control. The legal systems of their periods governed them as property, subject to their fathers, their husbands families, their kings, their occupiers. The mortality rates of childbirth in the ancient world meant that every pregnancy was also a potential death. The loss of a husband in any of these periods meant a loss not only of companionship, but of economic existence, legal standing, and social identity. To be a woman in Canaan in 1600 BCE, in Jericho at its conquest, in the fields of Bethlehem, in the palace of Jerusalem, in the hill town of Nazareth, was to live with a constant awareness that your continuation depended on decisions made by others about your status, your value, and your usefulness. What changed across these centuries, and what did not? The formal legal status of women shifted gradually across the ancient Near East. Codified law in various Mesopotamian traditions did offer women some protections, some capacity to own property, some recourse in specific circumstances. By the 1st century CE, under Roman administration in Judea, Jewish women had certain legal rights, though they remained subordinate in both Roman and Jewish legal frameworks. What did not change across all of these centuries and cultures was the fundamental reality that women's survival was architecturally dependent on male institutions, the household, the clan, the king, the empire, and that when those institutions failed or turned against them, women had almost no formal mechanism of appeal. What these 5 women share is not heroism in the modern sense. They were not rebels. They were not reformers. They did not argue for the rights of women in language we would recognize. They were people embedded in their own time, making decisions within the narrow range of options available to them, often under conditions of fear, loss, and profound constraint. What they did, what each one did, was refuse the particular form of erasure that her world had prepared for her. Tamar refused to simply disappear. Rahab chose a side when the walls came down. Ruth refused to let loyalty be dissolved by practicality. Bathsheba refused to let grief become the end of her story. Mary carried what could not be explained with a faithfulness that the text records but cannot fully illuminate. The genealogy of Matthew is, among other things, a statement about continuity, about how a story is made not only by its grand moments, but by the quiet, often painful choices made in ordinary places by people the world was not watching. A woman at a crossroads, a woman on a rooftop, a woman in a grain field, a woman in a palace, a woman in a small room in Galilee, each one continuing something that, without her, would have stopped. History rarely preserves the names of women like these. The records that survive, clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, stone inscriptions, census lists, are overwhelmingly the records of men with power: kings, generals, priests, scribes. The women who lived beside them, within their households, beneath their authority, moving through the daily labor of grinding grain and drawing water and bearing children and mourning the dead, they are largely absent. The 5 women in Matthew's genealogy survived the silence. They were written in. And in a tradition where genealogy was the architecture of identity, their inclusion was an argument, understated, unapologetic, that the line of the promised king had passed through them because of them, and not despite who they were, but because of it. The dust of Canaan and the dust of Nazareth are not so different, geologically speaking. The limestone that forms the bones of the Judean hills is the same stone that has been quarried for walls and floors and grinding stones for thousands of years. The women who moved across those stones left almost no mark that archaeology can find. No tomb clearly identified, no inscription bearing their names, no artifact demonstrably theirs. What they left was a line. What they left was a story in which they were present. What they left in the end was a name in a list. And sometimes that is everything. If there is a woman from history, a civilization, or a forgotten era whose story you would like to see reconstructed next, leave her name in the comments below. Every name is a door worth opening.